Good afternoon. And welcome to the course titled The Turning Point, the least understood week in World War II. It is a week which is not well understood. It's one in which the fate of the world hung in the balance and was really decided by the grim determination of one man. It's a remarkable story. There's nobody better than Stacy Wallach to tell us about it. Stacy, we're very glad to have you here today. Okay, a heroic effort. Stacy has taught us many times. He's brought history to life in a very interesting and informative way. He graduated magna cum laude from the Swarthmore Honors Program in History, Economics, and Poli-Sci. He received his LLB from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's been an adjunct professor at Pace University Law School, a retired senior manager of C.B. Richard Ellis, and a former New York City business trial lawyer. Stacy, you must have a kitchen full of these things by now. But here's one more.
I prize every one of them.
We really appreciate everything you do for us.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming on this gorgeous day. And this is a little different from some of my prior lectures for two reasons. First, because as we progress after today, I'm going to give you the opportunity to be much more active than in the past. Many of you have been marvelously helpful with questions, but as we move toward the final session, it's more than just questions I'll be looking for. It's really your view of what we've been talking about as it applies today. Because I think that what interests me about the subject of this course is how relevant and important it is to today's events. There's a second aspect of it that snuck up on me by surprise. The original goal and rationale for the course was just what you see on the screen. May 23 to May 30, 1940, when the English might have lost the war. This close. And that's worth talking about. But in preparing for the lectures, I realized that I had to rethink many of the aspects of the events of the prior 20 years that shaped that week that I'd always taken for granted. It was like the comfortable furniture of my mind. The old sofa, the scratched end tables, they'd been around for 40 or 50 years in my mind. I had never seen any cause to take a second look or re-examine them. But preparing for this course made it clear that I had to do that. And I came to some very different conclusions. And so I hope that the course will be both an opportunity for each of you to look at those tried and true conventional and conventionally accepted wisdoms and to take a fresh look, but also to use the process to think about whatever historical processes and events that interest you and take a fresh look at those. Because what it taught me was that the more certain I was that I understood A, B, and C, the more likely it was that it was time to take a fresh look. So this is sort of a brief syllabus so you can see where we're going. Today we're going to talk about Well, the first thing we're going to do today, with a series of about 20 slides, is look visually at that comfortable furniture in my mind. The inside of my 68-year-old brain before I started preparing for this course. And then we're going to start to look at some of the key events between the wars that so shaped that last week in May. And in the next class, as you can see, we're going to look at the so-called appeasers, because that's what really began my process of thinking anew. And then we're going to take, in class 3, a very close look at where Britain stood in May of 1940. And in the last slide that I'll show you at the first portion of today's lecture, you'll see a David Low, L-O-W, cartoon of May 1940 that says it better than I can. And finally, in class 4, we're going to look at that week, almost hour by hour. It was an astonishing week, totally unknown to the British people at large, kept amazingly secret for 50 years. And now known very well, but still very controversial because people disagree about what really happened. And in the last class, we'll try to, with your help, look at what my rethinking and my newer analysis really means for us today. You saw there was an article in the New York Times in which the Times referred to Barack Obama as a warrior president. Who knew? You know? And as they pointed out, neither the right nor the left gives him any credit for it. And of course, he's facing challenges that are really fundamentally different from those of 60 years ago. And yet I think that the questions of diplomacy, appeasement, collective security, unilateral military action, all of these are the same. The circumstances are radically different, but the underlying understanding of the processes is the same. So that's what it's going to look like. And as I say, over the first 4 classes, chime in whenever you want. We have a microphone to use so that everybody can hear. But by the time we get to class 5, I'm going to be calling on you by name, because it's really you and your thoughts about this process that I find of great interest. Now, here's one of those comfortable pieces of my mind as of 6 months ago. Think in your own mind. Come up with a visual image. Maybe 2 or 3 visual images of the human personification of pure, unadulterated evil. You've got at least 1 or 2?
There he is.
Look familiar? Now, I haven't changed my mind that he is pure and unadulterated evil, but one of the most painful things that I had to do in the course of preparing for this course was to come to grips with the fact that he's also done some extraordinary things. And he's an extraordinarily accomplished man. Did he make some terrible mistakes? Well, let's put it this way. Can you say to Mrs. Lincoln, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the rest of the play? All right, well, if you can say that to her, you can say to the world community, well, other than that, what do you think of Hitler? And I think it's incredibly important that we recognize that there are some extraordinary achievements that he made. And we need to understand why. Now, here's a word that since I was 10 years old, I knew was a bad word. There were 4-letter words that you got your mouth washed out with soap, and there was appeasement. There's a bad word. And, if you look at someone like Lyndon Baines Johnson, who wanted to be the great domestic president, a lot of his views about whether to get more deeply involved in Vietnam clearly came from the awful taste that Munich in 1938 had left, and the apparent lesson that everybody took for granted, that for 60 years I took for granted, that appeasement is a bad thing, period. Well, we're going to have to look at that a little more closely. And here's Mr. Appeasement himself. I mean, you just can't get a more visual image of an appeaser than Neville Chamberlain. And yet, he was a wildly popular politician and ultimately Prime Minister of Great Britain. When he came back from Munich, which was his 3rd trip to Germany to see Hitler, having done a really evil thing with Hitler, which was, divide up and essentially destroy Czechoslovakia, he was greeted with wild enthusiasm. Here they all are. This is Chamberlain, the French Premier Daladier, Hitler, Mussolini, Mussolini's son-in-law, Ciano, C-I-A-N-O, who was like his foreign minister. And if I were really smart, I'd know who these guys in the back are, but I'm not that smart. It's important to know that this was the 3rd trip in the space of a month and a half. It was the first time a British Prime Minister had ever been on an airplane, and everybody around the world noted that it was Chamberlain going to see Hitler at his headquarters, not vice versa. And Hitler outfoxed him. There's no question. Hitler was, well, as John Lukács says, and this was, John Lukács is, an extraordinary historian, and this was one of the phrases that made me shudder and then start to rethink my own comfortable furniture. Hitler was a gifted statesman in the period between 1933 and 1943. He was better at it than an awful lot of the people that we like to like. And of course, that doesn't change my ultimate view of him as the personification of evil, but it forces me to say there was more to him than just that. And here they are. You'll notice that there's somebody missing. The head of the government of Czechoslovakia. A minor detail. They were back home in Prague, literally at the end of an open telephone line, simply agog at what they were hearing from their supposed allies and protectors, the British and the French. Of course, the border between Czechoslovakia and Germany, which was on the eastern side of Germany, was far, far away from France and especially from England. And the truth is, at that moment in time, they had, the French and the British had no practical ability to stop Hitler from doing what he intended to do. And in these three conferences, particularly in the second one at Gettysburg, Hitler said flatly to Chamberlain, if you don't persuade them to give me what I want voluntarily, which was initially the western third of Czechoslovakia called Sudetenland, which was mostly German-speaking people. He said, I'm going to invade. At Munich, he said to Chamberlain, you either talk them into it or I'm going in on October 1. My army's ready to roll. And he wasn't kidding. They were right there on the border, ready to roll. I believe the actual document was signed at the beginning of the fourth week of September, and Hitler did not bluff. On September 30, he flies back with his famous piece of paper, and he was mobbed by cheering Londoners at the airport. And it took him hours to get to Whitehall and Buckingham Palace to report to the king because of the huge crowds of enthusiastic people. And we'll talk about that in a later class. The British people as a whole did not want war. But the question is, despite the fact that he was outfoxed by Hitler, and despite the fact that he believed in appeasement, mistakenly thinking that that would maintain the peace, was he an appeaser in the cowardly negative sense, or was he an international diplomat dealing with the very slender hand of cards he had dealt with? And we need to look at that. Chamberlain had succeeded Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister under the Conservative Party flag. Stanley Baldwin had appointed Chamberlain his Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is both the equivalent of our Secretary of the Treasury, but it's also the second most senior post in the cabinet. It's more than being just the Secretary of the Treasury. It's really in some way being like the Deputy Prime Minister. There had been an election called by Baldwin in 1935, and the Conservatives had won overwhelmingly. They had an enormous parliamentary majority. And when Chamberlain became the Prime Minister in late 37, he inherited that parliament. There was no new election. Baldwin retired because he wanted to retire. And there wouldn't be another election until the very end of the war, which we'll touch on because it was a rather surprising election. That overwhelming conservative majority in the House of Commons was enormously attached, both personally and politically, to both Baldwin and Chamberlain. They thought the world of them. And except for one brief moment in May 1940, they didn't really change their mind. When we look at Churchill in the years of the 1930s, the one thing that will stand out above all else, particularly for those of you who took the Churchill course, is how alone he was and how disrespected he was. Is that a phrase? Right. we have to start thinking about what that means and how you achieve it, because clearly they thought they had. Chamberlain was no fool. The fact that he'd been outfoxed by the great fox, or wolf, doesn't mean that he was a fool. He really thought that he had achieved peace for his time. Until a year later, when World War II started, although in a moment I'm going to suggest that it started a week earlier. Everybody who writes about the start of World War II, of course, says it started on September 1 when Germany invaded Poland. That's true, but I'm going to bring you back a week and let you decide for yourself when it really started. In between the Munich conference and his piece of paper, in the intervening year, Chamberlain had changed his mind, and he doesn't get very much credit for it. He had realized that Hitler was, among many other things, a thug, just like Stalin, just like Mussolini. But Stalin and Hitler were thugs of a very, very high order. And in the intervening year, he had had his eyes opened. That is, Chamberlain had his eyes opened. And at Chamberlain's insistence, had accelerated the British rearmament program in the belief that war was coming. Hitler, of course, who was very well prepared for the war, paid no attention to them whatsoever. And you'll see that he had an arrangement with the Soviet Union to split up Poland between them. And this is where we go back a week before. Now, over the course of the year before September 1, 1939, not only did Chamberlain accelerate the British rearmament program, he looked around desperately for allies because, number one, he was nervous about France, although France had what appeared to be the biggest army on the continent. And Britain, for 300 years, had traditionally kept itself safe by having bilateral treaties with whomever in Europe they needed to balance whoever was being the big aggressor at the time. The balance of power politics, I'm sure, is familiar to all of you. And in that year between the fall of 38 and the fall of 39, Chamberlain realized he needed an ally on the continent besides France. We'll talk in one of our classes, we'll talk about how riven by dissent and upset and weakness France really was. And finally, he concluded that Russia was his only likely ally of sufficient geographical position and military strength to balance Hitler. And he sent Sir Stafford Cripps, a very high-ranking British diplomat, to Moscow to try to work out a treaty of friendship and military alliance with Stalin. Stalin played a double game and pretended to engage in negotiations with Cripps, but it was all baloney. By the summer, he was engaged in intense negotiations with Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, which came to fruition on August 23, 1939, when they signed a pact that had a public part and a private part. And as I discuss that, you'll see immediately why I think you could argue that it was on August 23 that World War II started. Because it was essential to Hitler's plan that he fight a one-front war, not a two-front war. In the public part of the treaty, all they did was pledge their friendship, and that if either was attacked by a third party, the other one wouldn't go help that third party. The other one would be at least neutral. Seems perfectly straightforward. But in the secret annex, they agreed that they would jointly invade Poland. Hitler would take about 80% of it, and Russia would take about 20%. And they divided up much of the Balkans and much else. And most amazingly, Stalin, who was as eager for this treaty as Hitler was, for different reasons, Stalin agreed to send vital raw materials to Germany month by month for as long as the treaty lasted. Oil, steel, coal, food, absolutely essential items to keeping Germany going during the initial phases of World War II. And to show you how there is honor among thieves, Stalin kept his part of the bargain to the letter, even after he knew that Hitler had changed his mind and was going to invade Russia. You'll recall that in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded Russia, the Soviet Union, I should say, with massive, overwhelming force. 2 or 3 days before the invasion, when it was perfectly apparent that he had massed huge numbers of troops along the Soviet border, the Soviets were still sending trainloads of coal and food, because I guess a deal is a deal, even among thugs. I have to be careful. I think it's essential to use the word thug to understand the core of Hitler and to understand how he could outsmart these British gentlemen. But he was much more than a thug. He was a gifted international statesman. I hate to say that, but he was. Not that he didn't ultimately make a couple of mortal errors, but it's essential to understand he was a thug and so much more. Nobody, of course, outside of the parties themselves, knew about any of this. What the world knew was that they had signed a treaty of friendship. Period. That's what they knew. A week later, what we call World War II started. Now, you might say to me, do you mean that if Hitler hadn't been able to persuade Stalin to sign the treaty, he wouldn't have invaded Poland? I haven't the slightest idea. They didn't consult. All I know is that it was Hitler's prime goal, because he said so, to his cabinet and his highest ranking military officers. It was his highest goal to fight a one-front war. And he correctly estimated that he could make a deal with Stalin, that these two thugs You know, think of a poker table with two guys, each with a Colt 45 on the table, dealing the cards. As long as everybody knows where everybody's hands are, they made a deal. And what later, much later, became crystal clear was that Stalin had something to give him. The Brits really didn't have anything to offer Russia, except a lot of trouble. So it's not surprising that Stalin and Hitler made their deal. Hitler wanted a one-front war, and he wanted all that materiel. Stalin wanted to buy time. Stalin wanted peace with Germany until he could build up his own armaments program. And here's my favorite character of all time. He's the one guy I haven't changed my mind about. With all of his flaws, and they were huge, with all of his failings, and they were many, there was nobody like Churchill. And in September, I think at the very end of September, after the German invasion of Poland, Chamberlain decided to bring Churchill into the government as First Lord of the Admiralty. He gets no credit for having accelerated Britain's arms program. He gets no credit for having brought Churchill into the government. He gets no credit for being willing to change his mind. He just gets no credit. Chamberlain is just, the ultimate scapegoat for everything that went wrong at the end of the 1930s. And it was very controversial with the House of Commons as a whole. They did not like Churchill. They didn't like him personally. He was a half-breed. You know which half-breed he was. His mother was an American. And he had been responsible for one of the worst disasters in World War I, as First Lord of the Admiralty at that time, Gallipoli. And he was a loudmouth. You invited him to one of these wonderful English weekend country dinner parties, and he dominated the conversation. Nobody else could get a word in edgewise. And in England, among the aristocracy and upper middle class, that mattered. In addition, they didn't, even though he was born the son of an aristocrat, they didn't really regard him, and when I say they, the Conservative Party sitting in Parliament with their overwhelming majority in 1939, they didn't really regard him as a gentleman. And that made a big difference in England in those days. It wasn't just that he had an American mother, bad enough. And it wasn't just that he was a loudmouth, bad enough. And it wasn't just that he was a warmonger, which he was, bad enough. He had to work to earn a living. Well, that made a big difference. His father did not leave him a fortune. And for almost his entire adult life, he worked as a journalist right away, a newspaper man. That's how they would say it. A newspaper man. And as an essayist, a magazine essayist, and as a writer of history. He actually wrote one novel. And he lived off of his earnings from his writing his entire adult life. And he spent more than he made. And that was unforgivable And he had to be bailed out by a friend of his, who, when he became prime minister, wrote out a check, wiped the slate clean. Most of all, he was unpopular because, in addition to being a warmonger in the sense that he insisted from the early 30s on that Europe was heading towards war and that Britain better prepare for it, he was also an arch Victorian imperialist. He loved the British Empire, and he was intent on hanging on to every bit of it. And the entire Conservative Party, very, very painfully, for the 20 years after Versailles, after the end of World War I, had persuaded itself that most of the empire was going to have to go to first Dominion status, then to some other kind of independence. And he alone, I shouldn't say alone, there were one or two others, but he, more than anyone else, insisted that Britain should keep its empire, and most of all, keep India, and not as a dominion, but as a colony. You will see when we get to the last week of May 1940, his great adversary inside the British War Cabinet, Edward Wood, Lord Halifax, had been under an earlier title as Lord Irwin, same guy, had been the Viceroy of India from 1925 through 1930. Not quite 6 years. And Halifax, despite the fact that he came out of the same background as Churchill, had used that 5.5 years to really move the whole political process between India and Great Britain forward, so that it was now really inevitable that they would move from being a colony to being a dominion. Churchill, inside the House of Commons during the 1930s, was vituperative in his speeches against Halifax and against what he had achieved in trying to move that political process forward peacefully. Yes?
Wasn't that very popular in England in terms of keeping the colony, keeping India?
No, not by the 1930s. And we'll get to that. By the 1930s, Britain was deep into the Depression, something that's so fundamental to understanding why Chamberlain wanted to appease Hitler. And the British people were much more concerned about jobs. The Depression hit Great Britain horrifically hard. And it was during the 20s and 30s also that the Liberal Party started which was, not unsupportive of the empire, started fading in electoral strength, and the Labour Party by the mid-30s had effectively replaced them. And the Labour Party was adamantly opposed to empire. And it isn't that there weren't some who were in favor of keeping India, but they were a fragment of the broad general view that if Britain was to survive and prosper in the modern world, it had to shed its colonial burdens.
I might be confused, but that's September 1940 is probably a mistake.
Speak up,
On
please.
the previous slide, it said September 1940.
Yes.
Wasn't he already,
That's a
that
mis-
should be 1939, correct?
Correct, that's a
All
mistake.
right, I was
That
pondering
just goes
the
to show you.
aspect
Thank you. I've been so busy rethinking everything that I got my date wrong. 1939, of course. Thank you. Yes, back there.
dominion and a colony?
A dominion is a stage in between. A colony is owned by Great Britain. They own it, they run it. Examples of dominions in the 1930s would be Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Effectively, they were independent. They had their own elections. They elected their own government. But they recognized the king or queen of England as their sovereign. And they were part of the British Economic Union. Of course, they didn't call it that. But the essential difference was that they had the freedom to elect their own government and have their own domestic and foreign policy, yet at the same time remain very close to Great Britain, recognizing the king or queen as their sovereign. Yes, sir?
Stacy, please, could you repeat the questions for the people now?
Oh, yes. What I've just described is the difference between a colony and a dominion. Now, we are going to look very closely at this date. And you'll see in the next slide why. But it's important to understand that when we focus in on the events from May 23 to May 28, that's 2 weeks after he first became prime minister. And the struggle that he went through is extraordinary because it occurred only 2 weeks after he became prime minister, and his, and I'm using the word his, meaning Churchill's, parliamentary majority in the House of Commons wasn't his at all. Remember, those people had been elected in 1935 under the leadership of Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain. And when he took the risk, when Churchill took the risk that he did in that last week of May, he had to deal with the fact that that 1935 Parliament, still sitting there, did not like him, had not shown him any particular respect. This picture, by the way, which I think may be the most famous photograph of Churchill, was taken by Karsh, K-A-R-S-H, in Ottawa, later in the war, when he was on one of his trips to see Roosevelt, and he stopped off in Ottawa to see the Canadian Prime Minister. And literally in between two meetings, they had persuaded him to come out for 5 minutes and see Karsh. I think that yes, back there.
There's another one that was taken at the same time with a big smile on his face, but we never see that.
Correct. You don't see the one with the smile on his face, although that's a very good photograph. I believe the instructor in the Churchill course mentioned that the way he apparently got this growl was he'd been sitting there with his cigar in his mouth, and Karsh casually walked up and just snatched it out of his mouth, ran back and caught the scowl, which of course is classic Churchill. But the most important thing to remember through these 5 classes is that when we get to the turning point, May 28th, he'd been prime minister for 2 weeks. The cabinet was mostly still the same. And of course, the House of Commons was.
Question from Greg Barrington.
As sort of.
Great Barrington question.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yes, I'm puzzled a little bit. Churchill, as prime minister, is head of the Conservative Party. He's the party leader, and yet.
No.
What?
No, that's not so.
Isn't that
Churchill was not head of the Conservative Party. That's a separate office that was separately elected by the House of Commons. They did not elect him head of the Conservative Party at that time. And he was on very shaky ground with the conservative majority. When we get to the class where we talk about this, we're going to talk about exactly how it is that the king appointed him, Churchill, the prime minister, on May 10, and not the person that everybody else thought in the Conservative Party was most suited for the job. But you can rest absolutely certain that he was not the political head of the Conservative Party. In fact, let me mention, twice in his career, he had switched parties.
Yes.
And they never forgave him for that. Indeed, it was one more on that long list of events that persuaded much of the Conservative Party that he wasn't a gentleman, that he couldn't be trusted. And believe me, even though it sounds so archaic now to talk about being a gentleman, it was fundamental to the proof of your integrity and trustworthiness and your worthiness to serve in a senior post in the British government back in 1939 and 1940. If you weren't a gentleman, you were not going to be included at any high level. Yes, sir?
Why was he chosen?
We're going to spend a good deal of time on that. And in part, he was chosen because of Chamberlain. And again, it forced me to rethink who Chamberlain was. So Hitler serves up a celebration of Winston's great day by launching the Blitzkrieg in the West. Of course, Hitler didn't know until either at the very end of May 10 or probably more likely the next morning that Churchill had been appointed prime minister. And his plans for the Blitzkrieg against Holland, Belgium, and France had been in the making for 6 months. So it's pure coincidence that he launched the Blitzkrieg on May 10. It had more to do with, in fact, it had been postponed several weeks because of weather. It's also important to very briefly understand what Blitzkrieg means. The blitz in Blitzkrieg means lightning. But it wasn't just rapidity, although that was at the heart of it. What it was a military doctrine that said you need to take tanks with heavy artillery on the tanks, you know, those long guns, and troops in fast-moving vehicles that can keep up with the tanks, right? What we now call troop carriers. And the Luftwaffe, fighter planes flying in close support. Rapidly moving tanks, motor-driven troops, and close air fighter support together. And the Germans practiced that. The Brits had tried using it at the end of World War I without success. Everything was too primitive at the time. But the Germans, the Germans really perfected it. What's funny is that that doesn't mean there weren't some very old-fashioned elements to the German armed forces. When they went into Poland, all of their artillery was pulled by horses. And indeed, the Poles actually had a horse cavalry who made the last cavalry charge of any war in the history of wars, with disastrous results.
I thought that after World War I, Germany was depleted financially and every other way. How did Hitler raise money to
We are gonna talk about that, and it's another part of my forced reappraisal of Hitler. He was a brilliant national economist, and he was much more successful at reviving Germany's economy than America, Britain, and France were at reviving theirs. But we'll come to that, because that's critical, of course. So here we are, and the other element to Blitzkrieg was that instead of frontally attacking the major army opposing him, you would use your speed and mobility to flank it and circle around it and come up behind it with such overwhelming force and speed that you would both demoralize that army and cut it off from its supplies, and you'd then be able to cut it to pieces. And that's exactly what happened. Yes, sir.
There's a very interesting thing on your picture, and that is that an American had a lot to do with the ability of the Germans to do what they did. The suspension on that vehicle is a Christie suspension. U.S. Army wouldn't adopt it. The British didn't like it. But
Yes. Do we have a mic? George!
sorry,
No, that's a very, very nice point.
You might want to use your laser too to show the suspension on it.
I just wanted to.
Right here, is this what you're talking about?
Yes, I just wanted to point out that on that track vehicle there, that's known as the Christie suspension. It was American, Christie had developed it. The U.S. Army wouldn't buy it, the British wouldn't buy it, the Germans bought it. And that's what made their tracks quite good in their days.
Yes. And just as Russia was more than happy to sell goods to Germany for cash, as you point out, so were American manufacturers.
Yeah, during World War II, we had what was known as the armored car, which could go about 90 miles an hour. It had a gun on top, I think it was 30 millimeter, a machine gun, one machine gun on the side. And the reason it could go for 90 miles an hour is because the armor was very thin. And then M1 bullet could go through it. So that took the principle that you're talking about, where you had speed and armament at the same time.
Yes. And what Hitler and his generals proved in this Blitzkrieg in May and June was that they were able to take all of these armored vehicles through the Ardennes forest, Ardennes, which the French, who had fortified their northern and eastern border with Germany very heavily with the Maginot Line, had not fortified very strongly, because they believed that the forests of the Ardennes were so thick that German tanks and artillery and troops in any numbers could not penetrate through the forest. Again, an example of the necessity of periodically rethinking that comfortable furniture in your mind. In fact, they came pouring through the Ardennes and caught the French so completely off balance that they completely demoralized the French army. However, we need to keep going forward because this is just a quick overview, remember, of the comfortable furniture of my mind. Yes, ma'am?
How much, I don't have the work was involved in this kind of civil war, but how much of Hitler's armaments, procedures, all that kind of thing, did Hitler practice? What were his relationships with Franco?
His relations with Franco during the Spanish Civil War was one thug to another. And I think you point out that it was a good place for the Germans to practice with their new military equipment. But we'll come to that. Now, This is the only map I will bore you with. Here's the Ardennes down here. We're ultimately going to see, actually it's up here. We're ultimately going to see that the Wehrmacht came through so rapidly that they were able to encircle the British and the French. What Hitler did was, just as in World War I, he sent some armies through Holland and Belgium because about 6 months, 7 months, 8 months before the war began, but before this aspect of the war began in May of 1940, a German officer, courier, with all the plans for this attack, had been on an airplane going from one point in Germany to another. It got lost in the fog and crash landed in Holland. The Dutch military seized this guy and took his plans and realized this is what Hitler plans to do in a month or 2 or 3. And they gave, not the plans themselves, it's kind of weird, they gave summaries of the plans to the French and the British. And there was a real division of thought in British intelligence and French intelligence as to whether this was the real stuff or a put-up job where this guy was a plant to try to mislead them with phony information. It was the real stuff, and it was a repeat of what they had done in 1914 and 15. They were going to send the Wehrmacht this way. So what the Germans did was once they realized that this guy had shown, had revealed all these plans, they rewrote the plan. They sent just enough troops down through Holland and Belgium so that the British and the French went rushing up there to meet them in the belief that that was the main force, whereas really the main force was coming around here. All right? And it was a brilliant move to lure the main elements of the British Expeditionary Force and the French Army up into Belgium toward Holland. A, because they really believed that that's where the German army and its main force were coming. And B, especially for the French, because they wanted to fight World War II somewhere other than France. They'd already tried that once with horrific results. So in 3 weeks, they circle around and they take Boulogne and Calais, and they start pushing towards Dunkirk. And what's important is that by that week, our turning point week of May 23 to May 28, the British Expeditionary Force and the French Army were reeling in defeat. And by the 28th, it was clear that they were going to have to be evacuated from Dunkirk, or else all would be lost. And on the 28th of May, 1940, it looked to the inner cabinet, the British War Cabinet, like all was going to be lost. And without understanding that, you can't understand how extraordinary Churchill was. They already had started organizing both the British Navy and the private flotilla of boats to go over to Dunkirk and bring it back. And as you know, this is just about the narrowest part of the English Channel here. But on the 28th, when things came to a head, nobody in the British government or the French government had the slightest idea whether the evacuation would work. The assumption was that it was more likely than not that the armies caught in this pocket would be killed or captured. And we have to keep that in mind in trying to understand this amazing week at the end of May 1940. In fact, the British Navy worked a miracle. one of the most painful aspects of it was that the Luftwaffe had a pretty good run at the men on the beaches. And the reason for that was because Churchill and his senior military command held back a significant portion of the Royal Air Force. That's the kind of hard decision I wouldn't want to make. Just 1 second. They knew in their heart of hearts that the invasion of England was coming. And they knew that if they were going to have any chance of surviving, the RAF had to be there, ready to go. And they didn't want to lose squadrons over the English Channel during the evacuation. So there was some real RAF intervention, but there was also a lot of bombing and strafing of these men during the 5 days, 6 days of that evacuation. Yes, sir?
The only point I was making on the other side, the only point I was making is that on the other side, during against Hitler, that Luftwaffe could take care of it, they held back the tanks. It wasn't for that.
Yes, and that's a very controversial thing. You are correct that from the 26th through the end of the 28th, Hitler ordered a pause in the advance of these troops. There were Panzer divisions right here, this one maybe, that had actually crossed the river. And if Hitler had not ordered that 2.5-day pause, no one can say, but the odds are pretty good that the evacuation would have occurred either not at all or only in part. It's very controversial as to why he did it. Some of his generals at the most senior level, guys like Brauchitsch, who was like the head of the military, above all the other generals, said, you know what? We should pause, gas up again, fix our equipment. They've been on the run, on the dead run for 2 weeks. We've lost men and materiel. We're about to kick them off the continent. Let's not lose a lot of men or take the risk of a breakout and a counterattack, because they didn't fully appreciate how completely demoralized the British and French forces were. So Brauchitsch clearly was saying, let's have a brief pause to rejuvenate ourselves, and then we'll push them off the continent. Hitler, if he had listened to the generals driving the tanks, and there literally were German generals on those tanks, wouldn't have done the pause. Hitler allegedly thought that the pause was a good idea politically because it would allow the British to maintain their self-respect. He was certain they were leaving the continent. It was just a question of whether they would be leaving in body bags or on ferry boats and troop ships. And he later, during the war and then at the very end of the war, made statements which suggest that he thought that his goal was to dominate Europe, not dominate the world, and that he respected the British and their empire, and that in his vision of a good, stable world, you'd have Germany dominating the European continent, Great Britain dominating other parts of the world with their empire, and America dominating the Americas, and that he was very comfortable with that. You will often hear people who maybe aren't as intensely educated as they might be talk about Hitler's desire to dominate the world. And certainly at this point it felt like it. He never said that. And there's no indication that he wanted to or thought that Germany was capable of doing that. What he wanted to dominate was Europe. He had contempt for the French, and he hated the Bolsheviks. And he didn't call them the Soviet Union. He didn't refer to it as Mother Russia. He was intensely anti-communist. And of course, the only thing to say when you think about that and his August 1939 pact with the Soviet Union, which started World War II, is it's ironic. But Hitler was, most of all in that 11-year period from 30, actually you can go back even before he was appointed Chancellor, from 32 to 43, he was a realist. And he was a very smart geostrategist. One second. So you really need to focus on the fact that he, at this point, was possibly very happy to let the British get away with their self-respect. Other historians of equal magnitude say no, it was just a mistake. He was nervous. He was so fearful of the success he had achieved, which, by the way, is very understandable. Nobody thought that he would wipe them out in 2 weeks. So he wanted maybe to take a pause just to get everybody in position, bring up reinforcements, etc. Yes.
Did he not feel that he also had political allies in England that he could cut a deal with and bring this quickly to an end so he could focus on Russia?
Well, we're going to see that he thought that the question is, for those of you in Great Britain, the question was, did he think that he had, did Hitler think that he had allies or possible allies in Great Britain with whom he could ultimately make a deal? I don't think he thought of them as allies. The fascists like Mosley were a tiny fragment. They had no popular following. And very shortly after this, I mean within days after this, Winston Churchill arrested all of them. All of them. Forget about habeas corpus, forget about the great British Constitution. He took the entire fascist organization, about 3,000 people, and put them in jail. Which is pretty much what Lincoln did, for those of you who took my course after the Civil War broke out, with the government and politicians in the state of Maryland, remember, which surrounded the city of Washington. And he very unilaterally suspended habeas corpus and arrested any Southern sympathizers, and was prepared to keep them in jail for as long as the war continued. And he sent then they had a regularly scheduled election in Maryland a few months later, and he sent in federal troops in their bright blue uniforms to every polling place in Maryland to make sure that the right people voted the right way. Yes, sir.
In light of what you just said, why the pact with Mussolini?
Well, whose pact with Mussolini? Hitler's?
Hitler's.
Well, that's very interesting. I have to be brief because it's like a side light from my main point. Hitler liked Mussolini. Personally, he liked him. And indeed, in 43, at the end of 43, when the Italians rose up and brought down the Mussolini government and put Mussolini in jail, Hitler sent in a very high-risk commando squad to rescue him. And they succeeded and set him up in like a little duchy in northern Italy until the end of the war. He liked the guy because he was a fellow thug. And he also respected him because he was a little older. He had come to power in 1923. Indeed, Mussolini had come to power in Italy the very year that Hitler had tried his beer hall putsch and ended up in jail. And, when he looked out in the world, well, there's Mussolini. He knows how to do it. So there was a lot of respect there. But Hitler didn't think much of the Italian people, and most of all, he didn't think much of the Italian military. He may have been the guy who invented the joke about the thinnest book in the world being the book of Italian war heroes. And the truth is that that's what I love about the Italians the most. They're a lovable people. In fact, my wife and I are going back there shortly. They are the nicest people in the world, and Mussolini was just this ghastly aberration. But to show you how sharply Hitler distinguished between his own personal feeling of respect for Mussolini and what he had achieved, and his view of the Italian nation as a military ally. After May 10, when the Blitzkrieg started, Mussolini called him up and said, "Okay, I'll declare war on France. I'll help you out. Us thugs have to stick together." Hitler called back and said, "No need, don't bother. This is my show. You can stay out of it." And until June 10 or June 15, when this whole Blitzkrieg was over, Paris fell, I think, on June 16. Mussolini finally declared war on France, and Hitler wasn't wrong. At this point, June 15, 16, Italy is on its rear end. Sorry, I misspoke. France is on its rear end. Italy invades, talk about a stab in the rear end, from the south, and the French military knock them right back. They've been blown away up here, but they have no trouble just giving the back of the hand to the Italians, which again, I think of only as ultimate praise for the Italians. And I'm not being sarcastic. So you have this, and by the way, Mussolini had taken Italy into some earlier military adventures in Africa, in Ethiopia, and had really embarrassed himself. Hitler was very much aware of that. Later, he said, "Well, I'll help you out." This is much later in the war. He said, "I'll help you out, Adolf. I'll invade Greece." Complete disaster. The Germans had to come down and bail the Italian army out. So, yes, he respected the man, absolutely respected him, but felt no great urge to have Italy be anything other than neutral. But here's an interesting point, which I'll only mention because we're really going to talk about it in a later class. The rest of Europe saw Italy at this time, up until the outbreak of the war, as a much more substantial military and economic power than we think of it now. They just had a certain cachet in European politics at that time that's going to play a remarkable role, an Italian role, in those events of the turning point of May 23 to May 28. Now, we're getting short. What do we have? Do we have 15 minutes?
15. Quick question.
Yes.
They saved 340,000. How much did the Allies lose?
At least 140,000 French surrendered. They lost essentially all of their artillery, equipment, tanks. They lost all of their equipment. As Churchill said, you don't win wars with successful evacuations. It was a disaster at the same time that it was a miracle. This photograph, by the way, is the real thing. These are Brits on the beaches in those last few days trying to hold off the Luftwaffe. The likelihood that these two guys survived is not high. Because once Hitler lifted the pause order, the Germans really moved in a major way. And the reason they stopped evacuating on June 4 was they couldn't hold the beach anymore. And this is just the tiniest view of the disaster that befell both Holland, Belgium, but most of all France, because the German armies really devastated northern France. They had no limits. It was total war. The reason we know this is an authentic photograph is it was taken by a German and is from their archives. The exact military essential that was their target here is not clear to me. And on June 14, they occupied Paris. The French government fell back first to Tours, Tours, in southern France, and then ultimately to North Africa. This shocked the rest of the world beyond belief, just beyond belief. Shocked me. I was still in my mom's tummy, but I was shocked. And again, the timing is so critical. Because when we think about that week of May 1940, he's now been the prime minister 6 weeks, and it's just been one total disaster after another, including one in Norway where Churchill himself was responsible before he became prime minister, when he was still First Lord of the Admiralty, where he persuaded Chamberlain's government to go try to occupy northern Norway to try to control the flow of raw materials there, and the Germans just beat him to it, outsmarted him, outfoxed him. 6 weeks after he becomes prime minister, this, of course, is the actual train carriage in 1918, where the French, British, and Americans made the German generals come and sign the armistice that ended World War I. Hitler brought it out of the museum and made the French generals come and sign their surrender here. And he blew up the monument that the French had erected on this site. It's Compiègne, C-O-M-P-I-E-G-N-E, Compiègne. The French, after World War I, had erected a statue of a huge German eagle on its back with a gigantic French sword through its breast. And underneath, chiseled in stone, something to the effect of justice to German war criminals. Hitler blew it up. And this was a very happy day for him. This, by the way, even though he looks like a general, is actually, I think, Ribbentrop. Could be. And this is a slender version of Goring. You know, he got fat later on. And I think, I forget, it's either this guy or this guy. I think it's this guy, Brauchitsch, who doesn't get a lot of press, but was actually the most senior military officer of all. And then we get another word like appeasement. I mean, collaboration. Is there a worse word in the world than collaboration? Just think of, again, in your own head right now, think of a visual image of collaboration, at least one or two. And here you have Mr. Collaborator of all time, Marshal Pétain. But Marshal Pétain, of course, had to deal with the facts on the ground. He had not been in charge of the government. He had not been in charge of the military. He was brought in from retirement to run Vichy France, the southern one-third of France that Hitler said you can run this yourself. The northern two-thirds of France, the Germans ran as a colony, essentially as a colony. But we're going to have to rethink collaboration as well, particularly in terms of what were the choices. And by mid-June, hardly more than a month after Churchill became the Prime Minister, he and the British people stood utterly alone. Now you can say, oh, well, they had Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And by the way, those countries would later make very important contributions to the war. But they were far away. They had no military ability that they could project on behalf of England and Europe. They were alone. There was no other ally. There was no friend. The United States? Forget about it. The United States was 18 months away from entering the war. And we didn't enter the war to help Britain. We entered the war because Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. As far as I can tell, what the British people as a whole should do every December 7 is get down on their collective knees and say, thank you, Emperor Hino. Thank you. And so it's important to see that 2 weeks earlier, when the British War Cabinet met, this is what they saw. Yes, it took 2 weeks for it to come fully to flower, but they, believe me, they saw it very, very clearly. Now, I want to talk in the few minutes we have left about World War I, or really its impact on events. We're going to talk today and in the next class, we're going to talk about World War I and its impact on the British and French willingness to ever go to war again. Remember they called World War I the war to end all wars? It's not a slogan. It was a deeply felt belief. We're going to talk also about armament and rearmament programs. We're also going to talk about the impact of the Depression. And as someone said, I think it was you, right? How Germany conquered the Depression and rearmed while France, Great Britain, and the United States did not. But I want to start, just in the few minutes we have left, by reminding us of something that we probably all learned in high school. But it's now so far away. It's almost 100 years away, 1914, when World War I began. But it might as well be 1,000 years ago. But of course it wasn't. And what I'm talking about now is the post-World War I impact of the consequences of the war. By the way, one Sunday ago and last night on PBS, on Masterpiece Theater, was a two-part program called Birdsong.
Birdsong, right.
And the reason I mention it is that, aside from the fact that I thought it was wonderful, I thought it was one of the best attempts to to give you a feel for what a World War I battlefield was like. And you could say to me, yeah, but you know what? It was 1/10 of 1% of the actual horror. And I would say, yes, but it's still better than anything else I've seen. Of the total, and as one of the characters said, the ultimate degradation of human beings. Just the total horror of it. So,
The Battle of the Somme. 60,000 Brits were lost in the first day.
and I think 25,000 in the first hour. You know what happened in the first hour? 25,000 Brits stood up and stepped over the edge of the trench and were mowed down. Just like that. The incompetence of British and French generals in World War I is beyond imagining. I mean, it's mind-boggling. I could forgive them if they did it once. Anybody can make a mistake once. They did it over and over and over again. And indeed, in early 1917, over the course of the first 6 months of 1917, when the war had been going on for 2.5 years, a very large section of the French army mutinied in the lines. It's a miracle that the Germans didn't pick up how extensive the mutiny was. And ultimately, the French were able to bring in other troops and settle the situation down. They then made a political judgment. We're talking about anywhere from 100 to 300,000 troops who rebelled. They had 3,000 court-martials, summary court-martials in the field. They sentenced 559 men to death, and they actually shot 43. And the decision to court-martial only 3,000, convict only 559, and shoot only 43 were a series of political decisions that Pétain and Poincaré, the French Prime Minister, made. It was really only 50 years after those events, when some of the French archives were officially opened. And starting in 1983, a wonderful French historian started going through them, literally one piece of paper after another, and putting together the true story and the magnitude of the French mutiny. And the reason is not because the French weren't patriotic and they weren't good soldiers. They were very patriotic and they were very good soldiers. But what was going on in the trenches in World War I was beyond all human bearing. And that's, again, why I say that this birdsong really, I thought, captured a tiny bit of it.
The war horse also was very ridiculous.
Yeah. Now, let me just, we really have only 1 minute, so let me just give you a couple of stats and we'll pick up next week. In World War I, the United Kingdom lost 886,000 men dead, 2 million wounded. 886,000 dead. France lost 1,400,000 dead, 4 million wounded. France was essentially hollowed out. That generation was gone. Russia lost 2,250,000 dead. Maybe nobody knows for sure how many wounded, maybe 5 million. The United States lost 116,700 dead, 200,000 wounded. But that's not a criticism of the United States. We only came in at the very end. Austria-Hungary, which was an ally of Germany during World War I, lost 1,100,000 dead. The German Empire lost 2 million dead, 4 million wounded. And just to top it off, as if the devil had really taken over the world. At the very end of the war, the Spanish flu struck all around the world. And for most people, it was as if it was just part of the war. You were either killed by a bullet or a bomb or the Spanish flu. The influenza may have killed as many as 25 million people in its first 25 weeks. The older estimates of 50 years ago, when statistical analysis wasn't as good, said that 40 to 50 million people had died worldwide. Current estimates say that it was 50 to 100 million people died from the Spanish flu. Britain had 250,000 dead. France, 400,000. You have to take that together with the casualties of the war. And what I'll end on is a kind of grotesque note that I think it's important to understand. Medical services were primitive compared to what they were in World War II and then today. But many men were saved, but so sliced up. And the prostheses and the various cosmetic ways of putting them back together were so awful. You would see these men on the streets of any city in Europe, all during the intervening 20 years, from 1919 to 1939. Just 1 minute, please. It wasn't that the Versailles Treaty stopped everything and then new lives began. For every dead man, there were 2 to 3 to 4 wounded men, many of them grotesquely maimed, living among the rest of the population. It was a constant reminder of how awful war was. And so what developed across much of Europe was a pacifist mentality, not a Quaker pacifist mentality, but a mentality that war doesn't work, it's too horrific to ever go through again, and what we need is a different system. And the system that many, many people across the world came up with was not the old balance of power that Britain had played for years, but rather collective security, the League of Nations, which we today through the UN to some degree ascribe to. That if everybody agrees that war is unacceptable, and we have a policy of sanctions against those who try to violate it, and we back up those sanctions with military force as a last resort, the belief was that through the League of Nations, we could erect a tiered level of collective security which would prevent a world war from ever occurring again. And that was a very, very powerful notion. It wasn't appeasement. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't even pacifism in the sense of Quaker pacifism, which is true pacifism. It was a belief that a better system through collective security and sanctions and military force through the League of Nations would work. Unfortunately, Germany was never a member of the League of Nations. Japan was never a member of the League of Nations. And guess who? The United States was never a member of the League of Nations. But what we're going to look at in the 30s is that even without them, there was a real attempt to make it work. And it was just that people weren't very good at it. They'd never done this before. We got better at it a little bit when we created the United Nations in 45, 46, but we weren't very good at it. for a long time. And one of the things we're going to do in the last class, if you remember the syllabus, is look at whether that works today. And I think you're going to see some examples where it really works fabulously and where it doesn't work at all. And we'll try to figure out why that is. So thank you very much.